Yeah, okay. All right. Hello and welcome everyone. We officially start off with our workshop today on building an academic argument in the history of economic thought. Of course, this the workshop as will be conducted by our two instructors. It's not only relevant to HET; it can be applied to any other kind of research and writing. But here we will work with resources that are more restricted towards the discipline of HET as such. So I would like to introduce our two instructors today to everyone. First, we have with us Maria Bach. Maria teaches at the University of Lausanne, and she has recently authored a book called Relocating Development Economics, the first generation of modern Indian economists. So it's a very exciting new book that we are all looking forward to go through. Our second panelist here is Shachi Seth. Shachi teaches at the Center for Writing Studies at OP Jindal Global University and also is a colleague of mine at the university here. And she has also done her MPhil from the Delhi School of Economics. So while Shachi teaches at the Writing Studies Center, but her interest also lies in economic thought and economic history. So making her a very interesting and useful resource person for us. So I'd also like to quickly introduce and speak about the other two organizations that are part of, making this workshop happen. So this workshop has been held as a collaboration between the Indian Society for the History of Economic Thought, which I guess most of you would be aware of, and the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, or IDEAS for short, which is at OP Jindal Global University. So ISHET was recently created in 2023, where basically we are trying to get together various young scholars, senior scholars, teachers, students, everyone who is interested in the history of economic thought. We have already conducted the first major annual conference under the banner of ISHET at the University of Hyderabad in 2024. But before that also, we've had some important conferences at Azim Premji University and other colleges and universities around India. So with this, we also hope to keep building upon the community of scholars interested in history, in economics. The second organization relevant here is IDEAS, or Office of Interdisciplinary Studies. This was an office opened up a year ago in at OP Jindal Global University, of which I am also a part of. And the idea is to create a space where scholars from different disciplines come together, engage in interdisciplinary research, writing, and conducting events, building collaborations with civil society organizations or other think tanks or research organizations here. At present, the IDEAS group has uh, has 7 research constellations. This constellation, understanding Indian economy. We also have other constellations that look at the topics such as urban studies, climate change and sustainability. We have politics, society, and history. So along these lines, we have different research constellations. You, if you're interested to know more, you can always visit the site, the IDEAS website, which is going to be shared here in the chat box for all of you to view. IDEAS is also going to start 2 academic programs this year. The first one is called is the MSc in Development Practice. This is going to be a non-residential program, which will be where the classes will be held in Delhi. It's a 1-year program with where, of course, it's a course that is looking at development studies, but at the same time also more closely policy oriented and also fieldwork oriented. The second program, which will be started, is also an MSc program. This is in development studies, which would be an online program. So both of these are 1-year master's programs. Do feel free to look through these details. The links for these will be shared here. Okay, so with that, let's return to the workshop, and I will end with my introduction soon. So just as you all would have seen from the posters and all, the aim of this workshop is to create a sense of what it means to build up an academic argument. So whether we are writing shorter papers, like just even student assignments, or whether we are writing longer forms of academic writing, such as a research article or even a dissertation, there are certain fundamentals and basics that involve how we create an academic argument. So our the workshop instructors are going to take us through this in much greater detail. And just before that, I'd like to inform you all of the schedule of this program today. We will have the two instructors will first give us a brief introduction to what they understand by what it means to build an academic argument. After which we will be spending some time looking through some writing samples. Now, these writing samples should have been shared with you. In case you do not have access to that, we can also put it up in the chat box so you can get a sense of it. So we will be looking at 2 writing samples of student assignments in the first half of this workshop and work around them to see what it means to build an argument. After that, we will take a 15-minute break at 5:45 p.m. and then we will resume the second half of the workshop at 6 p.m. So with that, I'd like to hand over the floor to our instructors. So yes, so Maria, would you like to go first or any order?
Yes, I'm happy to go first. I'm just checking that I'm sharing. Just want to get a confirmation that what you see. Do you see just one slide or do you see several slides?
No, just the one slide.
That's perfect. All right. Wonderful. It's great to be here today. Thank you, Sharman, for the introduction. And it's exciting to hear all the things that ideas are getting up to. So we're going to be talking about this idea of building an academic argument today, which is, of course, sounds very easy, but it definitely isn't. And I can admit that it is always very difficult for me. So I'd want to start on that point that if you find it difficult, it's completely normal. We need to learn how to build arguments. And so that's why it's great that you've decided to take some time to come talk to us today. As Sharman said, I'm at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, but I did my PhD on Indian economics at King's College London, where I had access then to the British Library and the Colonial Archives, of course, close by, which is why it was a good place to do it, even though I concentrated on Indian economics. So I guess I wanted to start there just to kind of give you very, very, very brief background. So I am as an economics student, I got very interested in history economics in my master's, and eventually fell onto this topic of Indian economics in the late 19th century, and a generation of economists, around about 9 of them, who I call the first modern economists in India, mostly because all kind of modern economics was established in this period from 1870 to 1900, and India was no exception. And so my question in my PhD, and we're not talking about research questions today, but I did want to kind of just mention the fact that you start with a research question and then you build an argument, right? So what I asked in my PhD was what shaped Indian economics' idea of development, and that is what then my book has become, and I'm going to be giving you an example of how I built the overall argument in my book in a little bit. And so why is this why am I sharing this question here? Well, especially because the history of economics is notoriously Eurocentric, or at least Western-centric, whatever word you want to use, global North-centric, whatever. And so this question is actually not a question that's been asked very much. And so I positioned myself in this literature to say, okay, we've ignored these thinkers as economists, not as other things. They're famous for other reasons in India, but and actually, just as a little bit of an anecdote, because you've gotten a writing sample by Tinkerter Roy here. I met up with him as a first-year PhD student, and he just told me that I could find nothing at all and didn't see the point in this project. So just to say as well that you're going to get people, you're going to get counter arguments, and we're going to be talking about that, I think, quite a lot today, that counter arguments are actually really important, and you need to be aware of them, and you need to find rebuttals, right? And that's also part of the process of building an academic argument. Okay, so then my thesis became this book that's just come out at the end of last year, Relocating Development Economics. And the idea here is that I'm saying, okay, if we look elsewhere, then we find new thinkers, we find new ideas. And what my main claim here is in this book is to say these Indian economists, as I said, a group of 9 economists that were the first graduates of the imperial universities in India, reconceptualized an idea of development that they thought was more appropriate for their Indian colonial, especially, context. And here I've just listed the titles of the chapters to give you a sense of how I built this overall argument. And I'm going to go into more specifics in the next 2 slides. So apart from, of course, the introduction, which is more self-explanatory, I needed to set up the context, right? Because in the history of economics literature, India isn't dealt with very much. So my audience needed that context in order to understand India. Of course, the context here is, for this audience, isn't as useful, but or as necessary, rather. But in where I published at Cambridge University Press, it was essential to have this first chapter of contextualization. And then I'd talk about these protagonists, how this term Indian economics came about, to give the reader again a sense of who I'm talking about, who I'm analyzing, etc. And then I go into my argument. Okay, so how do they produce a win-win model of development, which is my last chapter here, as you say, chapter 6. And so here I give the reader the information that they need bit by bit, right? So in my chapter 3, I talk about how they think about societal change, right? Because in order to think about development, which is changing society, you need to understand how society changes, or the automatic processes, let's say, of how society changes. So that's why I talk about stages of civilization, and I go into how some of these economists took this idea of stages of civilization from other economists before them and changed it to adapt it to their context. Same thing in chapter 4, they talk a lot more about regress than any other economists at the time, because they saw a lot more regress in India. And then chapter 5 and 6 are their idea of development, and I split them up into 2, because one is about how should you develop, how should development be on the home front, so domestically. So they talked a lot about balanced growth, about it has to be agriculture and industry. And then chapter 6 is this idea that they debunk the idea that David Ricardo came up with at the beginning of the 19th century, which is that some countries should specialize in agriculture, some countries should specialize in industry. And they say, no, everybody needs to industrialize to make everybody better off. Because if the Indians, for example, industrialize, then they would have more money to demand goods from all over the world, and you would increase overall global trade. And then just a short remark on my epilogue, on my conclusion, is just I say I was able to find this because I use a new approach in history of economics, which is another claim in my book, that it's also about changing the way we approach history of economics. Okay, so now to get into a bit more nitty-gritty, and I know I only have a few more minutes, so I won't take too much more time. So we could think about building an argument using something called Toulmin's model, which has these component parts. And this is a long list, I apologize. But I'm just going to go quickly through the pointers. And then I think once we start reading the samples and we start working with the text, these things will become clearer. So the idea is that you have this overall claim. As I said, I had this overall claim of the fact that the Indian economists came up with a win-win model of development. They conceptualized a win-win model of development. And this claim, right, needs to be debatable or at least not self-evident, right? It's not like, it can't be something like the sky is blue, or that might actually be debatable. In fact, it's the wrong example. But as in, there needs to be something that is that people are not everyone is going to agree with it, right? That's what makes it interesting. And then you need data, and that is evidence, facts, right? And it backs up your claim, right? It's trying to persuade your reader that your claim is correct. And then you have something called the warrant, which is what links the data to the claim. And what I mean by that is that it explains how the data proves your claim, right? And then you may have some, or good academic arguments have some kind of backing, which means that there are certain additional supports that strengthens the warrant, so additional evidence, etc. And then by qualifier, Tillman means this idea that you need to specify the degree to which the claim is true, right? In science, it's often not the case that you're either right or wrong. There's some degree of to which something is true or not, right? Truth is quite a difficult thing to get to, right? And then the last one, which is where the writing samples with Sen and Roy and the other rebuttal is really important. It's really necessary to be aware of what other people think about your claim, right? And they're going to have different claims, and you're going to have to you have to acknowledge those in your argument, right? To say, okay, well, some other people say this, but I think they're wrong because of X, Y, and Z, and then you give evidence for that, right? And here I'm going to share, I hope we can share these slides with the participants afterwards, because there's a lot of text here. This is just to kind of give you a very brief idea of how I then proved my claim, right, in my book, one of my main claims, right? So the idea is that the data is the citations in my archival materials, right, where I find this idea of a win-win model of development, and the warrant, how I've understood it in my argument, is that I show how the Indian economists built their argument of why there should be this win-win model of development and not the kind of more dominant European model of development, which is essentially this comparative advantage, right, that I mentioned earlier. And all the way that the qualifier, for example, for me is this idea that, of course, they didn't reinvent the entire wheel, right? They didn't reinvent the whole idea of development. That's not what I'm claiming. It happens very rarely, in fact, in the history of ideas, because you always kind of stand on the shoulders of giants, as we say. And we're always going to be impacted by the ideas that exist already. So that's important to specify. And then, of course, the rebuttal, right? There are historians of economics that believe that these economists only copied and merged thought that already existed. And so I need to be very well of those arguments and argue why that wasn't the case. And to say it very simply, I think that those scholars concentrated a lot on the kind of the censorship, the sense of control that the colonial empire had over India, of course, and didn't kind of read these texts as economics texts, and so therefore didn't find what I found. All right. So just couple more things about Tillman, but we'll get into it more in the next part of this workshop. The idea, of course, is that you need to be persuasive in your argument. So you need a good structure so that the reader can follow what you're saying, and it's clear. And then, of course, there are lots of rhetorical advices. Again, I think Chachi will mention this as well, and we'll talk about specifics in a little bit. Yeah, and I do want to just say that you cannot become a good argument builder or a good writer without help. And I've just put a list of resources that I used a lot for both writing my thesis and my book, which were just essential to building arguments and writing persuasively. So we'll just share these later with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Maria, for that. Now I'll hand over to Shachi to give her also her introductory remarks.
Okay, thanks, Sharman. Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. So today's workshop is largely going to focus around us looking at argumentation in economic thought. But at the heart of it is a question of how do we build something that can be original enough in a space where there are already so many voices, especially of excerpts, authors who you are going to be reading, getting mind blown by at times, getting confused by at times. And despite the presence of so much literature, how do we as younger scholars actually manage to find that little space where we can come in and talk, right? And Maria has done a great job of giving us like a basic breakdown of the argument. And through those many moments that, let's say, a claim, evidence, a warrant, reasoning brings in, I'm going to operationalize that a little bit for you, where we are going to see how do these things actually work in the practical element, right? Some part of it, I think, will get covered when you're reading through the excerpts that we've shared with you. And I think we'll give you like enough time to go through that. And once we walk you through it, I think it is also, writing is largely a reflective exercise. Writing is also an exercise in thinking. It's also an exercise in reading. So when we are talking about writing an academic argument, at no point of time are we going to only restrict to the act of writing, right? Because the larger process of making an argument involves categorization, classification. It's a great exercise in you picking up elements of things that might be relevant to your work, putting them in separate boxes and seeing possibly how those boxes can get connected, right? And then where do you step in as your own original thinker to say something about this larger debate that seems to be taking place, right? My focus in today's workshop is going to be on how do we locate ourselves in an argument? How do we locate an argument firstly? How do we locate ourselves in an argument? And how do we eventually articulate this location that we have found for ourselves? For me personally, when I was writing my MPhil thesis, I think the largest challenge I had was that the more I read literature, the more I found myself having nothing to say really, right? I felt like the experts have really said everything there is to be said, and all I keep doing is rehashing their words in paraphrases, in summaries. And the second you start catching yourself in the act of summarizing or paraphrasing is the moment where you actually enable yourself to take a step towards making what we can call possibly an original argument, right? So I think in through the first exercise and through some of what we do in the second half, the important part is that you catch the reader, sorry, the author in the act of making their argument, and then also catch yourself as the reader in seeing where you get convinced, what actually moves you towards conviction, what moves you towards a rebuttal. And I think once you step in as the reader for like the first half of this workshop, in the second half, your possible movement towards actually writing an argument will also become much clearer, right? So that's how I want us to look at this workshop throughout, is that the act of writing is not isolated. It is an act of thinking, it is an act of reading, and it is an act of classifying and you finding your own voice. So let's not separate them for the purpose of this workshop, at least. I think that's all the intro I want to give. If we want to give them time for reading, we can do that. Maria?
Yeah, right. Okay. I mean that's good. So yeah, Maria and Chachi, how would you like to proceed? Just the other thing we're working on, and which I just to point it out to all the participants here, we realize that at present you don't have permission to turn on your cameras, or I think to even unmute yourself. So firstly, we will be just getting that permission granted. Although maybe I can even hand it over here if people want to start talking, but while we're sorting that out, Maria and Shachi, how would you like to proceed, and what instructions would we like to give to all the participants till then?
Yeah, so I have a button here to let them speak if you need me to press, just so you know.
Yes, yes. And in fact, the participants, anyone who wants to talk, I think you can raise your hand if I'm correct. So that option is of course also there.
Yeah. So what I'd like us to start by doing is looking at these two writing samples, and I guess I'll just say just two things, like take 2 minutes to talk about these writing samples. So I taught a class on the development economics in Paris for several years, and the essay that I gave my students at the end was this one. So the question was, to what extent is growth the same as development? Right? Is to what extent is growth the same as development? It's actually written at the top of one of the essay samples. So these are two real essays by two students that I've asked permission to share. Of course, it's anonymous. And one of them did really, really well. It's probably one of the best essays I've ever marked. And the other one did not so bad, an average grade. And so and I won't say anything more about which is which, because I'd like you to take a moment to read these if you haven't already, and have a think about which one you think is the better one and why. Right? And then I will ask you more questions later. Does that sound okay, Charmin? We can give them like
Yeah.
if 15
Yes,
minutes?
yes. Yeah, sure. So just to
Carmen, I'm also
just
typing, I've typed 4 or 5 questions in the chat box, which
okay.
I'll be sending. So as you're reading, if you can keep these questions as also something that you're thinking through, although I think that is self-evident in the exercise, but in case you come later or something, just do think over these questions.
Yeah. So Shachi, I think I've realized the questions that you have typed in are only sent to the panelists. I'll try to
Okay.
I'll send them out to everyone. Okay. So I am just just to everyone who is here,
I'll just done.
I'll just place it in the chat so that everyone can view it. Okay. So the questions that are
If
given in
anybody
the
has
chat
any
right now
questions now.
Yeah. Even I
are
think.
yeah. So
Are the
the questions
instructions
that are
clear?
placed in the chat box right now, which everyone can view, these are the questions that Shachi is proposing that you keep in mind as you read through the two sample assignments that have been shared by Maria, right?
And
Are
yeah,
there
if
any
anybody had
questions?
any questions
Yeah.
about that activity now, they can
Yeah.
put their hand up. And oh, there's a question.
Yeah, there are others who are saying enabling
Yeah, we
chat
should
for all.
enable
Okay, so
chat.
what I'm trying to do is allowing everyone to talk.
And
Maybe we can also, once we are done with any questions, participant questions, maybe we can set a timeline for when we want to return back after doing the reading. It's 5.
yeah, I think we should. I think 15 minutes. So
Yeah,
let me just check if I'm getting. Your time would be
5 p.m. It's 5 p.m. sharp here. Would you have to personally allow everyone, Charmin? Like, oh God.
It's okay. I'm almost through the list, so we can already see everyone's turning up on the screen. So
Yeah.
okay. Right. So just to ask now that we can okay. There are some questions from people who are saying that where have these essays been shared? So what we'll do is I'll again these where are not the questions? Sorry, where were the sample readings shared? They were sent out
I
to
can add
by
them. I
email.
can add them. I can
Yeah.
add them to the chat.
Yes, please. Yeah, please, Maria. And if you can just make sure that when you're adding them to the chat, it is for everyone and not just the panelists.
Yeah. Mm. It's not letting me add the documents. Uh-huh. Yeah, they should be
Please
added to
just
the chat.
look at the document shared by Maria. The others are
Yeah.
for a later exercise.
It's called
So only
Development
the
Growth
two
Sample.
shared by Maria.
Yeah. Okay, just everyone again, sorry for the confusion. So it seems now multiple people have shared it, but just please in the chat box, but do look at the two Word documents that are titled as development growth sample. So there should be two separate ones on that. So that's what we are going through for the first half.
Hello. Hi. I haven't received the documents on the chat. Could you
We've
please
sent
reshare
it
them?
again. We've sent it again, Ojasvi. Can you check once? Maria would have shared too.
Yeah, I just sent it once more time. Okay. Let me see.
हाँ हाँ हाँ. சூடா போயிடுச்சா அங்க சூடுக்கு இருக்கும் நேற்று என்ன சாப்பிட்டாங்க மோமோஸா எதுக்கும் செக் பண்ண சொல்லு ஒழுங்கா அதை டேட்லாம் மீட் டேட்டு கொஞ்சம் செக் பண்ணி கொஞ்சம் பத்திரமா இருக்க சொல்லல
Maria, do you want to try sending a personal chat to Harshit with the samples? Maybe he will get it.
I'm chatting to him now. He said, yeah, I have, and I'm asking him. You should see that too. Huh? You should see that chat too. I've just asked him for his email address so I can email them to him because he can see the questions but he can't see the documents.
There's also Ojasvi who has written. So we have Ojasvi and Harshit who can't seem to access. So
Okay, I'll send him.
yeah, both have given their email IDs.
I'll do that now.
Could someone confirm if the others can access the text?
Yeah, we are able to access the text on the chat.
Okay, thank you.
And just to announce it, these readings were all the 5 different readings were also emailed earlier today morning. So maybe some of you, if you look up your email inboxes, the email you registered with for this workshop, you should be able to find it in that inbox.
Yeah, I've just sent the email to the two of them. If anybody else needs the document sent to their email again, I can do that.
Okay, it's 5:20 p.m. here. So, can we start with the discussion? Uh, have have most people been able to go through the two student sample essays?
We can
Yeah, we
we
can.
perhaps assume that there's been enough.
Yeah.
We've gone through some of it. So I would like to start by asking kind of a general question, if anybody had a sense of which essay built a better argument. So there's
think
someone
we're
asking
asking for 5 more minutes.
minutes, yeah.
If we could just get a sense from a few people at least as to have you been able to go through most of it, or
If you have the option
because
to
we need
raise your hands, please raise your
yeah,
hands if
yeah.
you've read the texts. Might be easier for us to figure out.
Okay, yeah.
So two.
Yeah, then I think 5 more minutes maybe.
Okay, yeah, there are
Please
few
read.
asking for.
You can unraise your hands. Thanks, Gerard and Shazia.
Say something. Speak. Oh.
Yeah. Yes, please go
You're
ahead.
able to hear me?
Yes, yes. Yes, Gerard. Yes.
Yeah, I just looked at the two papers. I read them in the morning. You see the second essay, I'll just give you that number of the file. The one which says, says 68. Just give me a minute.
Yeah, the one that has evolution at the top.
Yeah, I mean, the one which has, I'm speaking about the one which has the word evolution on the top. So in comparison with the other paper, which is one which has the number 68. 60. I'll just check. Give me a minute. Yeah, one says evolution, improvement, and success, while the other says both seem to be saying the same time. But I mean, I'm talking about the paper which has those tables. I mean, those graphs about the number of times the word development or growth has appeared in the gesture repository. You
Okay.
get that particular paper?
Yeah.
Yeah. Versus the other one which speaks about the Aradomar model and those entire chronological way in which these ideas seem to be coming out. The two papers there. Now,
Right.
on the face of it, in my opinion, on the face of it, yeah, the second one, which is the one which has those graphs, those trend lines, and all those things, seems to be looking like a better one. Yeah, because at least there is a certain claim where he speaks about the role of interventionism in the way development is defined. That's one very important proposition that's put forward. There's some kind of a context in the way development reports are trying to look at it and how development is looked at development versus less developed and those dualities issues. There's some kind of a structuring that seems to be doing good there. And there's some evidence which has been looked at by the data which is being given, right? Like the gesture repository and then the growth rate, And there is some bit of attempt in the end towards just before the work cited that small paragraph, where some bit of current counter debates are mildly looked at, right? So it looks therefore like a better paper for me in that sense, a better essay from that perspective. But I have a little bit of a what to say, grouse against that essay is that I'm not very sure whether that is an essay in the history of economics or is it an essay on the history of economic thought. I'm a little confused there when I look at that paper, though it looks nice, well structured. The arguments seem to be well in place, but I'm a little confused whether it is more a paper in the history of economics than it is in the history of economic thought. While in that, if that argument, based on that argument, the previous paper, which doesn't seem like as well structured as the one which I first originally claimed to be, which is talking about the way Smith looked at it and the way the classical economists look, the neoclassical tradition. That seems to be having the promise of being a paper in the history of economic thought more. Just that the thing I could have improved would be is could have probably looked at more archival and quotes from original works and could have extended the arguments of the writings of these original writers. That would have probably improved the paper better. That's my assessment of these two papers. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, really interesting point about history of economics, history of economic thought. It's a very wide debate as to what we should call ourselves. I don't think we can go into that into this session. I would have burning questions for you as to how you define these things differently, because it depends on who you talk to. But I'm going to leave that to the side because that's not the topic of the workshop. But very good that you've kind of that you kind of picked up on the points of this the better essay, let's say, and how there's a claim and then there's some backup of evidence and there's even some acknowledgement of counter arguments at the end and so on. That's great. And then now let's see if it's gone 5 minutes, maybe somebody else has something that they'd like to also add.
Yeah, I think now we should at least have our at least 20 minutes to discuss this.
Yeah,
So I'm sure by now people would have at least gotten a decent sense of the papers. So enough to start a discussion. So maybe we can even think about so Shachi had raised some questions which we had posted in the chat box, right? Which you could keep in mind while reading. So maybe we can address those questions and frame a discussion around it as well.
I'll post them again, the questions, for those who don't see them.
Thanks, Maria.
But they're the same kinds of ideas of what I was asking for. And then if anybody feels up to it to identify the components of the Toulmin model that I talked about. So the claims, the evidence, the warrants, the qualifiers, the counter arguments, to kind of pick the argument apart.
Yeah, if anybody wants to give a response to this, please either feel free to raise your hand and answer, or you can
also
unmute
type
yourselves and give your response. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about the essay while going through it on the basis of the questions that you asked. So on that basis, I think in my opinion, essay grade 95 seems to me to be a better essay compared to the essay 68. Because in essay grade 95, the writer has actually started the essay with a thought that has been drawn out of a personal experience. And then they have made, and thus they have hooked the reader right at the start. Then they have proceeded to make the claim of examining the role of interventionism in the way development is defined. They have given their point of view while drawing from the related literature. Then they have backed up their claim, which was the second component of the Tolman's model that you presented. And then they have linked that data to the claim. So the warrant part is also established. They have tried to give additional evidence for it, but then I think it could have been more presented in a better form. Then I wasn't very sure about the qualifier part, so I'm a bit confused there. And they have drawn upon the necessary counter arguments, so the rebuttal part is also there. As for essay grade 68, why I don't think so it matches with the other one is because it's just tracing the evolution of how the debate has been shaped. You start with classicals and then neoclassicals and all those schools. But it is just, and at the end, there's just one component of linking the thing between the debate between linking the two of those together. So it just doesn't, it just states that based on the previous argument or the previous discussion, you can see that there is these two things are linked or something like that. So I don't think that that's a very good way of breaking the argument. They haven't broken it into the necessary components. So some work that could have been done on that. That's it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you really hit the nail on the head about the difference between descriptive writing and analytical writing, right? The 95 essay has used the evidence at his or her disposal to prove the claim that they have at the beginning, right? Whereas the second one is trying to just show his or her knowledge about what's going on, which is important. The context is important, but it doesn't address the question, doesn't answer the question, and the claim is it might be there, but it's too vague.
Right. I think another thing that we run into very often when we see essays like this is like, let's say, essay 68, where there is just a series of literature given one after the other. That tends to run into the territory of writing maybe an annotated bibliography, right? Where you've done a great bibliography of that particular question and you've put your notes against it essentially, and you've presented it in the form of an essay, vis-a-vis the other essay where you can see the literature actually getting reviewed by the author and they are stepping in places, they are bringing anecdotes, they are bringing examples from outside and constructing a narrative that is, as Maria pointed out, more analytical rather than descriptive. I think that is the major movement also that we are trying to make in this workshop, is that how do we move away from the trap of just getting caught in descriptive writing when we are working through a vast amount of literature, especially. Yeah, so thank you, Gerard and Shuchita. I think Kranti had her raise up.
Yeah.
If we mispronounce your names, please, really sorry.
Kranti is correct. No, I just wanted to add on to her point regarding this paper 68. Although it didn't even feel like it was tracing the evolution of the economic thought or even the ideas around growth and development, like why was not answered. It was more of a compilation of definitions. uh, I think like when we write, or even like when our students write, sometimes this is what we see. They're simply going in a linear fashion, maybe tracing the timeline that okay, this has been the definition, this has been the definition, or probably categorizing it into different schools of thought, but not really giving more to the context of why, or the seminal papers, for instance, what is the context in which they're really talking about this kind of thing. And for me, just to connect to like my doctoral program time, like for instance, I knew about structural transformation models of Lewis in masters, but mostly like a model, and I didn't know that. I never read the original of Lewis, and so I didn't know he was talking in the American context or something like that. So the context is often stripped away from the definition. So this paper seemed more like jotting down the definitions. Yeah, so I just want to add that.
Very good point, especially for history of economic thought and history of economics. Yeah. And I did want to just answer the question of the qualifier, and perhaps just because maybe I was unclear about what that meant. It just meant that you nuance your argument. And I think to some extent this student does this at the end in the 95 essay, where they say, well, definitions of development vary depending on the scholar that is dealing with the concept. It's at the very end. And so there is some kind of qualifier to say, look, I'm saying that overall growth and development aren't the same, but it depends on who you talk to, right? There's more that could be done there. I do want to specify that this is also a third-year bachelor essay, right? So I'm not expecting publishable work from these students, obviously.
Yeah,
Anyone else?
on qualifiers also, I think if I may add, if you start to think of it in terms of very basic ideas, let's say you say something as basic as smoking is bad for health, right? The second you begin to expand on the usage of the word bad is where you start qualifying your argument, right? So if you are, anytime you say someone is a bad author, someone is a bad director, the second you qualify that bad into arenas of maybe someone is someone plagiarizes their work, someone is patriarchal in their notions, someone glorifies violence. Those are the moments where you start nuancing that argument, right? So rather than falling prey to some kind of a blanket statement that trickle down economics works, right? The second, if you do believe in that, the second you can expand on what you mean by working, that is where you are qualifying your argument, right? And you're putting it to actual debate rather than just saying a blanket statement. So I think broadly that is what qualification means, to put it in very layman terms.
Yeah, just in fact, if even I can come in at this stage, I think which you even mentioned here, the aspect, what I find very telling is that whole aspect of the descriptive and analytical mode of writing, which are kind of evident between the two, like one where one seems to be and by that I mean descriptive in the sense of more in the mode of summarizing the existing arguments that you can draw from multiple sources, say, which is more evident in essay 68, and uh, and of course in essay 95 goes beyond that. Of course, you have to things to an extent in order to give, as we say, whether we call it giving it one's own voice or bringing in one's own kind of analytical twist towards the understanding, and also building connections, from between one to the other. And I think that is where somewhere there, and making those kind of shifts also lies the shift from analytical, and which is where people are then able to make their own interventions or their own contributions to any scholarship.
Are there any other thoughts, comments on the writing samples that we read? Okay.
I did want to, I can just add, because I think there's one component in argument building, which is using rhetorical devices, right, in order to persuade our audience. And someone, I forget who it was, but one of the people that talked about the essays had noticed that at the beginning of the essay 95 was that there was an anecdotal experience that person had, and that's a rhetorical device, right? It's kind of to start the essay off with something that talks to the person and explains how that impacted them, and that can then interest other people too, right? And there are other rhetorical devices like asking questions, for example, which are of course not meant to be answered because it's a text, right? You're answering, but it's meant to as a provocation, right, for the reader to start thinking about something, which kind of invites them into the argument, right, and say, hey, let's think about this together, right? And so I guess if anybody had noticed other rhetorical devices in the texts, they could perhaps share those.
Yeah. Let me just share my screen. I had a few things that Sharmin, I can't seem to.
Okay. Shachi, you should have permission, or otherwise because I think yeah, Maria and you would have the same permissions here.
Yeah, but somehow it's just saying that host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, okay.
That's odd, even though I'm listed as a panelist.
Yeah. Or you can just drop the if you can just drop the file and then I can share it.
Right, yeah, I can do that maybe.
Okay, but maybe we can also ask this question of everyone here, that based on looking at reading these kind of texts and all, what do you what comes across as, where does the argumentation lie? Maybe we can even identify some specific things that essay 95 is saying versus been making connections where essay 95 in specific places is doing a better job than say essay number 68, because that is where we will be able to understand the subtleties of where you can actually build the academic argument. So maybe if people here are able to identify specific points like that.
Sharman, I've shared the slide with you. If you can open and just go to slide 2, which is workshop materials. Oh yeah, I can share now. Thanks. Wait, Sharman, I'll do it. Okay. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think some pointed questions I had after reading through 2 of the materials is that something that excerpt, which I will call excerpt 98 at this point of time. So what excerpt 98 does is that it really tells me why the question that they are engaging with is important at all, right? While with question 2, I am left grappling to some extent as to why this question of development and growth as synchronous, as synonymous, or as different concepts. Why is that debate important at all, right? And what the other essay does right at the onset by setting up this basis of how intervention becomes a modality through which development is measured, they complicate the question of development right at the beginning, right? And to me, it says something as a reader that I know that there is an understood framework of looking at things. And this question is, this essay is probably introducing a complication into that understanding, right? And immediately the essay becomes slightly more important because it is dealing with a question that already has engagement over a series of debates. Whereas on the second question, I am just wondering that where is all of this reading going to lead to? Secondly, what I found interesting was that there is a classification of the debates that happens in the 98 excerpt that is done through the author's voice, where he's looking at development and growth through different models, whether it is that of intervention, whether it is that of this binary of developed and underdeveloped and non-developed. The frames through which we start looking at this development growth question is introduced by the author. Vis-a-vis in paper 68, there seems to be some sort of a confusion about what the debates really are. They are simply put forward in the mode of classical, neoclassical, Keynesian, whatever the chronological order that is followed, right? But the debate itself doesn't get qualified for me. A third thing I wanted to pose as a question also to all the participants is that at what point of reading the paper did you feel like you knew the argument of the paper?
Is it a question to us?
Yeah, it's a question to you.
Okay, and for me, it was easier to understand the argument of paper 65 or 68 rather than 95. But
Right.
did they follow it through is a different question. But how did they do it? But at least, yeah, I think the opening itself, I understood the 60, I think 68. better
Right.
than-
You understood the argument that they were presenting?
Yeah, I mean, what is it that they want to do and how they're going to do? I think it sort of became clearer.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
do you want to point me to the argument? Because sometimes, and I think in the second half of this workshop, I'll deal, sometimes we tend to get confused between the objective and the argument of the paper, right? And some papers will set up the objective really, really well, and they'll give you a
Okay,
good
okay.
introduction as to what is going on. but the argument itself will not come out. Others also, if you could look at what point in the two papers does the argument start emerging?
Right, it's a really good point, Chachi. It's like the 68 paper has the question at the very beginning, right? Do we advance through developing or through growth, or are they one in the same? I think it's not quite the question I asked, but if that's an objective, right? But the argument then I don't see.
Yeah. Exactly. I think this happens to us even as writers, right? Where we are so concerned with framing the question itself in the best possible manner that we forget that there is an argument we have to come up with post his, eventually.
Yeah, to answer the question or answer to the question.
Yeah.
It's also another way of saying it. Yeah.
Maybe we can
Also-
even sorry, is somebody
No, no,
else?
yeah, it's just me, Kranti here.
Yeah, Kranti, go ahead.
I was just seeing, so when we go through the 68, actually the way they framed the question itself didn't give any scope for argumentation. It's like the framing we're going to compare. And so there is no particular position that the author is taking in the 68. Am I reading it right? Yeah.
No, right.
Exactly.
And I think to some extent, which is why they are also ending up doing what the moves that they are making in their essay of tracing this history and comparing like different classical model and post-classical model. And so I think that's also the tendency. The second we signpost something in the beginning of our essay that in this paper I will compare, I think we are also setting for ourselves what that paper will end up.
Which is what we should do, but it's true that then it's very important that what you set up at the beginning is what you really want to do.
Right. And which is why these small words, right? Reflection, in this paper I will reflect, in this paper I will explore, in this paper I will argue. All of it ends up doing a major job for us in argumentation. So they are not loose words to be, just used. And I think it really sets the tone of how we enter the essay or the argument. Okay, others, any other opinions? Maybe after that we can close for a break if there are any thoughts. And
I might be thinking about this the wrong way, but I think in essay grade 95 for me, both the objective and argument were pretty much clear right at the beginning, because somewhere the person who's written essay grade 95 has said something about the conflicting definitions on growth and development, and something about being inextricably linked in a historical process. And then the person has, in the very next line, they have written that what what is important is to discern who continues to institutionalize development and how. And then they have clearly pointed out that they'll be what they'll be end up doing. So the argument has been put forth, and then they have broken down the that argument into the necessary components. So for me, it became clear right at the beginning that this is what the person is doing, as against essay grade 68, which pointed out the objective, but then they are not actually presenting an argument.
absolutely, yeah. I think even at the beginning, if you see, both the essays are also using definitions as a major like part of their essay, right? They're just going over definitions. But in terms of qualifier also, as Maria pointed out, one is qualifying those definitions through this framework of how they get defined in this paradigm of development and growth. And the other is simply saying that, as we can see, there has been a movement over time from growth to development. I think that's the only line I found that is sort of even reflecting back on the definitions. So one is setting it up as a debate and therefore also making it right for you as an author to step in and have something to say. And the other is just, again, in an act of descriptive writing, simply saying that, as you can see, there has been a shift from growth to development. So that chronological sort of method continues.
Which also can be refuted the idea that we only look at development today too. So
Right.
yeah, which the person doesn't add as a rebuttal, right? To say
Yeah. Or as a qualifier, right? Where you could just nuance it while you're introducing that there seems to be something about these competing definitions. Okay.
we should perhaps take a break and
Yeah.
then get back to it.
Can we
Should we take
return at 6?
Yeah, I was just also. I think we've gotten one bunch of responses. Maybe so now we can take a 15 minutes break. Instead, we'll come back at 6:05 p.m. IST. And maybe in the meantime, if people can, based on the discussion that we've been having already, if you can kind of spend some more time with these two essay responses and think about the questions that were raised and based on the kind of discussion we've been having so far as well. So we could come back and then get a more clearer sense of where the argument lies and how is it being built up in that sense, right? Okay.
Shavmin,
So yeah, so we'll come back at 6:05.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kranti.
Meanwhile, is it okay to share the slides which Maria was presenting?
Yeah, do you want me to
Or I
send
can-
the slides?
Yeah,
Can I-
on the chat box maybe, because I
Yeah,
would
of
like to
course.
see that format, the model that you shared.
Yeah, of course. And I also think it's this next workshop is also on building our own academic arguments, right? So you can also have a think about if there's an argument that you'd like to work on.
Yeah, and the rest of you, please, in the second half, this is a workshop. If your surroundings permit you, please do participate a little bit, because otherwise this will not really work.
Yeah, we really need this to be, thanks Sachi for pointing it out. Yeah, the more interactive, the more fruitful the workshop would be. And I also wanted to mention, by the way, Kranti, who is joining us here and who's just now requested the slides, which Maria has just shared in the chat box. Also, so Kranti is here. She's the co-lead along with me of the Understanding Indian Economy Research Constellation and Ideas. So yeah, so if anybody also has more interest in or wants to find out more about the constellation, we have Kranti here as well, who's part of the discussion.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, 15 minutes then.
Yeah. Um, yes, yeah. Hi, everyone. I think Shachi and Maria would be also here. Should we just let's start with the second half of our of the workshop? By the way, just wanted to ask the participants who are here, do you all have permissions to switch on your cameras? I know you can unmute yourselves, but in case you are also able to switch on your cameras, that would be great.
I think participants have also gotten filtered, so maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Oh, Kranti saying there is no option to switch on cameras. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that option is there.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a
Unfortunately,
shame.
yeah, because I think what happens is sometimes when we create these Zoom links for all our talk, because they usually tend to be talks, then this highly interactive workshop mode, the default mode is to put that participants who register are not given permissions so that there's less disruption, but it's not working. And I think it was a little bit of an oversight in planning to not remember this would also be the case. But okay, we'll work with this for now, and this is our first such workshop, so I think we've kind of figured out some of the chinks that we can work on. So yeah, okay. So yeah, so Shachi and Maria, why don't you all take over? I think you want to now maybe work with either these the sample writings or with other excerpts that we have shared.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just quickly share my screen and build us up into what I have planned. Give me a second. Maria or Sharmin, please feel free to step in at any point of time, because I think there will be moments where we will sort of be saying things that are connected. Okay. So we've gone through this. There are some small things that I wanted to start off with, just going over the excerpts again quickly, which I will be tying in together as the sort of presentation ends. But can you all please look at the screen and look at the parts highlighted in yellow? And if someone could give me a little bit of their reflection on what this part is doing, and is there an alternative way where this could be done? Yeah, Kranti, please.
Um, so you're asking what these yellow highlighted parts are doing and how we can reframe them, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's yeah. Okay. So I was thinking it. So this is like next definition, next definition, next definition. So there are like so many. So tabulation was one thing that came to my mind. If they could tabulate it meaningfully, or even to begin with, group them in their own way, how they look at it, other than simply. I know they have done this neoclassical, classical, etc. That way of categorization.
Yeah.
But taking on the fundamental or the core definition, or like core concepts that are common to certain definitions, if they could have phrased them together, I think that would have been better.
Right, definitely. I think that kind of classifying and categorizing could have worked really well. A lot of times that can be done merely through the act of making a long citation, right? Where you say the debates in the field have moved from questions of finances to questions of whatever new perceptions of growth. And then you follow it up with like 8 citations of people who have been participants of that debate. So rather than going from one to the next, to the next, to the next, apart from that, do you think there's different language we could have used instead of next, and what could that language have done? Gerard, do you have something to add?
Yeah.
I think you're on. Yeah.
Said, no? kind of using next is too repetitive, makes it very redundant. That's one. Redundancy is an issue there. But if you look at the blue highlights, I'm sorry, I'm going to sidestep what you're saying, Sachin. If you look at the blue highlights, the themes of those various perceptions are coming out, right?
Right.
In those blue highlights. The writer could have connected those themes and seen that there is a connection or where there is a disjoint that is happening, where the shift is taking place, and probably put some of these probably names of even people more as footnotes of some sort. You understand? And in places could have actually quoted original portions of their work.
Right.
I think in my understanding, what is missing in this paper, which I think is paper 68, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah, is a glaring miss of certain original quotes. I mean, in some places you really have to quote them, and sometimes if you look at some of the serious work in the history of economic thought, if you read, for example, The Economics of Good and Evil by Thomas Edler, the massive quotes that are done, and then you iterate out of it. You iterate the argument out of it. In other words, a massive sense of qualifying has to be done. It's a very massive qualifying exercise, a qualifier exercise you do. That's one way of writing, piece in issue. Especially if you read Economics of Good and Evil is a fantastic work that you see. Much more recent, and that's how it is done.
Quotes are very helpful, but at times we are limited by them because of a lack of space or a word limit or the kind of writing that we are doing. So if this is a student writing where they have to present an argument,
second also is the fact that when you're using the quotes, even your sources need to be legitimized.
Right.
In history of economic thought, because it is it's a work of history as well. You understand? And I think that would have been good in both the papers. The legitimizing the source. You need to locate the source and legitimize it.
Right. I think, in one way, I think the word history itself is extremely loaded, right? And as Maria said, that the question of what becomes history of economic thought or not is...
that positioning needs to be there.
Is a different question altogether. But definitely, I think some citations could have added a moment there. Maria, do you have something?
Yeah, I do want to just mention two things. So the structure that the student has used is chronological, and that's not necessarily wrong. It's the way he's used the words, the next, this, and now we're going to talk about this, blah, blah. It's too informal and poorly done because it doesn't take the reader by his or her hand and says, we're going to walk through history and look at how definitions of development have changed over time. I don't think the order needs to change, because if this student has decided that it needs to be chronological, which is not a bad idea in a history of economics paper.
Absolutely.
But it can be classified, yes, but the timings and the dates of the actual definitions need to be there. So one way he could have changed this would be like, in 1955, this happened, and then maybe contextualize it. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, I think we cannot confuse what qualifier means here. It is not evidence. Citations are evidence in history of economics. So citations are essential. This student got a low grade because there were no proper citations. Referencing was also not done correctly, but that's another point. So citations are evidence. They're not qualifiers. Just to clarify that point.
Yeah, and at times citations can really do a lot of work of this word limit, right? Where you have 5 different authors who have said the same thing with differential arguments, and you can put them all together and give like 5 citations, and that does a lot of legwork for you, where you don't have to go, this one said this one said this one said this. One thing I think that we really miss out on again is the work that signposting can do. Right? Rather than saying next definition, use of words like whatsoever, moreover, on the contrary, which just creates a relational sort of, moment between two different authors also. So if we are contrasting Sen with what Reinhardt is saying, is there any other word that we can use that is not just next? Right? Is it on the contrary? Is it expanding on this further? So if we can catch the act of analysis that those two authors are making, I think that goes a long way in also helping us situate where we will end up coming in. Okay. So similarly, I wanted to see the blue parts. I think I read through the entire thing, and in all these definitions, the blue parts are the only moments where you see the voice of the author coming in. Otherwise, it's just definitions. I'm happy to see if you all can find other moments where there is, the original voice of the author coming in. But I think it's only the blue parts that really give us, as opposed to essay number 2, right? Where the second, even this is the part where they are going from definition to definition, but it's done through an analytical framework, which can be debated within moments, but which is showing us how these definitions are actually being treated by the author, right? So this is the question of voice that I thought was very different in the two essays as we read through them. Because in one, whether through the use of quotes, personal anecdotes, or just the structuring of the argument, the student seems to have come through in some way, right? And this is like a common pitfall, I think, when we are students, where we just get caught up in the onslaught of literature, right? Okay. So I think Maria has covered most of what an argument does, but I think just to revise, having one central solid claim, which could have supporting subclaims, strong relevant evidence, and reasoning that connects it all. Now, parts like qualifiers become a part to some extent of the claim, of the reasoning. Um, Something like data will become a part of the evidence, archival work will become a part of the evidence. And moreover, under all of this, context and location is what will drive what is also called warrant, I think, in some moments. Is that right, Maria? Would warrant relate to the context?
Yeah, well, yeah, it could be, I guess, part of it. It's just the warrant is just the explanation of how the data backs up your claim.
Right. Okay.
So if the context is that's what it does, then okay. But
Right.
it's explaining to the reader where you're taking them,
Right. It's a part of the reasoning in some ways. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, some things, again, I think we've gone through these, is what makes an argument ineffective is that your claim should have some contestation possible. As Maria pointed out, your evidence should be reliable, relevant, and you shouldn't be taking too heavy a burden of proof upon yourself in your argument, which is why limiting your argument in some ways is essential. Uh, in terms of rhetorical elements, I wanted to point out this Aristotelian framework, which is, I think, a basic one that is followed, is that of logos, ethos, and pathos. Logos being where we appeal to logic and where you bring in logical reasoning as a form of forwarding your argument. Ethos being used setting up an authoritative voice, having some ethical backing, which is where I think citations can do a lot of work for us. And pathos as the part where quotations, anecdotes, even ideological moments, right? They can move the reader forward into having some sort of an emotional connect with the writing. Kairos also becomes important in the context of today's time, especially in the publishing world, where we start seeing that what actually is relevant in the time when we are writing this paper. But I think that is secondary at a student stage. Okay. Now, the main part I wanted to focus on is finding your voice. And maybe if I can get some participants, how many participants do we have left? I can't see.
No, we have a good 19 participants right now who are
Okay.
currently logged in.
Okay, can I ask you all to let me know, when you're writing a paper, how do you bring your own voice in? What are the ways in which you present yourself in the paper, especially in academic writing where we are not using first person voice so often? How do you enter your paper and move it forward? Anyone want to come in? Maria, do you think you want to tell us, how did you, when you were writing your book, how did you find a moment in like this onslaught of the debate on development where
That's a
you wanted
struggle.
to step in?
It's a struggle. It was an uphill battle.
Always.
Yeah. But how did I find my voice? I think there maybe two things. One is the very pragmatic thing, right? You need to read enough in order to understand what's going on, and then to feel confident enough that you can persuade people that you know enough about the field to then add to it, right? So that's the kind of pragmatic side where, and I think we can get lost in reading, but I think one advice I had that was just pivotal, like really, really important to me, was my supervisor said, the minute you read something new that you feel as if you have already read, so hence you're reading a new article that you've never read, but it's saying similar things to other articles you've read, that's when you can stop, right? Because nowadays we can't read everything. There's just too much out there. So that's the moment where you go, okay, now I can start actually putting down I can stop reading exclusively and start thinking about my arguments. That's the first thing. And then the second thing about, I think it you need to garner confidence, right? So, and the only way you do that is by practicing more, right? So practicing writing, but also practicing building arguments, which can be done in also informal as well as formal situations, and through, you know, orally, like we're doing here today, right? So going to conferences, presenting your ideas, or presenting it in your courses, in your lectures, and so on. So you need to practice with your voice, right? And even if that means at the beginning you're going to be saying things that you regret later on, that's part of the process. Right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I changed my MPhil question 4 times. So regret is definitely a part of this. Yeah, Kranti, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I'm just adding because others are not pitching in. So, sorry for
No,
taking
please,
too much
thank
time.
you.
No, but you raised this point about voice, and I think it is so important. Even towards the end of my PhD, I had a word with the professor, another professor, not my supervisor, and she said, "I have never seen you being so underconfident about your work or whatever." So then I went back and I realized why. And then I later went back to her and I said that I have finished writing my thesis, but I think I still don't know what my voice is, right? I mean, I really needed to spend so much time to understand or get their voice. And the second challenge was to understand what is my voice and what is my supervisor's voice, or what is my voice and what is the voice of the seminal authors in that, right? I mean, it always, my voice is always shadowed under that, and I really never knew. But I think after teaching, I mean, through teaching, you are now making bold statements, you're taking examples, thinking freely, much more freely than while writing. Then I think I started figuring out my voice, and it started reflecting in my writing. So that now, and that the moment that perspective was on, argumentative writing became a bit more easier than what it was earlier. So for me, yeah, that was it.
But that I think can be a little challenging when you get your rejects from your journals and they give you a long review. That review can probably create a lot of you know lack of confidence on your voice. That can do that. So we have to be very careful. But I always, I appreciate the reviews. It's good, but I also find that I need to find my own voice within the review comments.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Surely, anytime I think, yeah, please,
Because the
Shani.
review comments are still somebody
yeah.
else's voice in all effective terms. However solid it might have been. It's true. I mean, they're very good. They're good signposts. But it's still, I need to discover my voice in that. And that's a challenge I always face.
Yeah, sorry, if I can come in here. So we do have one response in the chat box from Dennis Thomas, which is saying when you're talking about how do we work out ways to put in our own voice, is to so Dennis has written, connecting between two ideas from different authors and pitching in how your argument is navigating amongst it to a new exploration. So I mean, well, so Dennis, of course, has kind of given us, explained the larger process to us, and which is what most of the time I think all of us are doing that only, because it's not, I think the majority, 99.9% of us scholars, when we are working, we are just trying to oftentimes just navigate between the works of the great scholars, so to say, in that sense. And, we are putting in a few lines here and there as to where we have found gaps, or another way to think about it is if we find a small gap between 2, 3, or 4, 5, whatever major works in an area. So either you can, and as I think, as Shachi were mentioning, na, sometimes it's through also then the usage of some useful and clever words also, like, when we say moreover or however, this shows that, when you, supposing if you're trying to talk about Tirthankar Roy, and if you read Tirthankar Roy, you may find problems with his understanding of, deindustrialization in 19th century India, then which maybe we will discuss later to some extent, but then you can write however evidence suggests to the contrary, and so there you kind of bring in your own voice also, and you can also rely, and but at the same time we will rely on other existing secondary literature to bring that in there, or if we have conducted maybe our own original archival work, or we have combed through other sorts of primary materials. I mean, I'm using the example of archives and primary sources here, where especially since we are working in the realm of history of economics, or even history of economic thought. So maybe these are the smaller ways in which we are able to then also bring in our own voice and move into a somewhat more analytical mode as well.
Absolutely. I think, and all of this is exactly what I meant when I'm saying something like a taxonomy of arguments, right? As Maria pointed out, that your first thing is to read a lot and to understand that what has already been said to some degree. And I think creating within it this sort of gradation of what the arguments are, where do they lie, what are the debates in the field where I am talking, familiarizing yourself with what has already been talked about a lot, and then locating a gap, right? And I think even in the papers we read, one of the papers does that sort of taxonomizing. I don't know what the word is, but yeah, it does it in an original way rather than going by a pre-existent sort of chronological taxonomy, right? So the way we classify the existent debates can be one of the moments where we introduce something original in our voice, right? There could be something that a pattern that we are recognizing in the arguments that sort of shifts the debate a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, however we want to imagine it. I think most importantly, the act of reading also has to lead us to the act of locating ourselves in the argument, right? Also in the timeline of arguments, in the chronology of arguments, that is fairly slightly easier to do because it's a linear thing that you're following. More than that, I think to locate ourselves in the debates in the field, right? Maybe can someone reflect on any kind of writing you've done where you have found yourself talking to a very major debate in the field? Harshit, you raised your hand. Sharmin, I think someone has the hand.
Yeah, Harshit. Oh, okay. Allowed to talk. Harshit, can you unmute yourself and respond? Trying to. This is strange. 1 second. Okay, as far as I can see, I think Harshit maybe has the permission to talk or not.
Sorry, ma'am, I have spoken. That
Yeah,
was by mistake only. I'm
No.
not traveling, so I won't be able to ask questions, but I'm really enjoying the session. Thank you so much for
Okay. Okay. Right. Yeah, Kranti.
Okay, since nobody responded to that, yeah, so in my work, I try to engage with the debate on agrarian questions. So there is this two strands of literature. One, there's this Bernstein versus Byers debate, talking about different parts of agrarian transition. So for me, the problem was, I mean, I understood, I spent quite a good time in understanding the nuances of both sides of the argument. But when it had come to writing, I'm finding myself as I'm critiquing or whatever I'm thinking was against Bernstein's line of argumentation and more towards buyers. But just not having the confidence to put it in writing, right? My guide would tell me, why are you shying away from taking a position? I would think that who am I to take a position against these big scholars or something? Maybe I'm missing something. But so positioning, and I think it sort of helped because I'm not at all not looking exactly the same question that they're looking at it. I'm trying to address or answer another question through these debates. So and that whatever question I'm looking at is pointing, the evidences that are emerging are pointing more towards one line of thinking, right? So yeah, I mean, for me, when you say the confidence part, that also sort of comes here, and especially when we are looking at debates, I think it becomes difficult to sort of take a step as early scholars.
Right. Thanks, Kranti. Did all of you get a chance to read through the materials that we shared on Tirthankar Roy and Amartya Sen at all? I know it's additional suggested readings only.
I've been able to look only at the student. So came in the morning and after time.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of reading also. So do
Reading
you
it, so it
think
was
we
little.
have time to maybe read a little, Sharmin? Or should we?
Yeah, we can do that. Or alternatively, just to reduce, because this would take a lot of time to read.
Yeah.
Maybe what do you think we could maybe just look at small
Yeah, I
excerpts,
have
maybe
this
share it on,
excerpt.
yeah, just share it on the screen, and maybe we can compare some shorter excerpts
Right.
from the screen itself and work with that.
Right. Okay. So I think if we can just look at what the debate largely is about, this is the text that we shared about whether famines are man-made or not, which is something that is a very, I think, rich debate, especially in a post-colonial, colonial sort of understanding of development. And in the Indian context, Amartya Sen looks at famines as a failure of exchange entitlements rather than anything that is pointing to a larger Malthusian framework or let's say just a climate, geography, ecological problematic, right? And Tirthankar Roy steps into this debate and he argues that it is not something that is made by the state, right? They are not man-made, and that the state does the series of things despite which some of the famines happen, right? That's the paper that we are looking at. Now, in this particular paper, if we can just look at this page where I found him explicitly, in one of the moments, explicitly telling us what his argument is. Here he's talking about the ecological debate, right? And he's saying that how the ecological debate, how ecology is largely responsible for famines rather than the state itself. I think in the usual, in most of the debates, the fact that the last famine happens in 1925 in Bengal and post-independence in India, there are no major such food shortages that happen at such a mass scale, right? Smaller holes are obviously there and they count up to a lot, but nothing is happening at such a large scale. I think that becomes one of the evidence that most authors use in order to argue that the colonial state is an active agent in the formation or the coming together creation of famines, right? And yeah, this is, I think, where Tirthankar Roy steps in. I'm sure you are all familiar with the argument, but given that we don't have time to read, I'm just revising it for myself also. Did the screen go away?
Yeah, the screen went away.
Something happened.
That text. I think the second paragraph is the most important, right? In that showing.
Yeah. Give me a second. Let's see what's happening. Can you all see it now?
Not the screen.
Yeah, somehow I'm unable to.
It's fine. I think the real matter is in the second paragraph. Takes his position.
May I say something?
Please, Maria.
Yeah. So obviously Roy is a key thinker in the field of Indian economic history, and he's really done lots of great things for the field, right? He's brought in new discussions that weren't really allowed to be talked about before. And that's really, really great, right? And it's also really great that it produces even more debate, right? Because that's what research is about, right? I do want to just say that because I think we can be angry at him for saying things we don't agree with, but he's a great scholar. And I think it's a bit of I'm not as familiar with his famine debates as his debate on deindustrialization, but I think because what I think is unfortunate in this debate, what it seems like, at least from the writing samples you sent us, was that he's not being as nuanced here as he is with the deindustrialization debate.
Yeah.
Because
That's
in
also
the
working paper, the one I shared. So we'll give him that much that the one I shared is a
yeah,
working.
and his new book is really on ecology, looking at like city states or city, like the economic history of certain cities, ports in India. So perhaps it'll be more nuanced when that book comes out. But the because on the deindustrialization debate, he adds nuance and complexity to debate that was not quite as complex already. It was a good debate, but his contributions were necessary to bring us closer to understanding why there was some deindustrialization in India, or rather whether there was and where there was industrialization, where there was so and so I'll just say that perhaps the nuance is missing here, and that's why people get a little bit angry or disagree with this argument. But then I was just quickly reading I also think that he kind of brushes over what the counter arguments say. So what do I mean by that? In the sense that he's categorizing this history of famines as in either it's just this bad colonial state that produces severe famines, or it's ecological disasters, right? Again, that's not nuanced enough to me to be a good argument, because it's obviously going to be a combination of both. And of course, as a scholar, you have to say new things, otherwise you don't get published, right? So he has to say something different from the others, because otherwise he doesn't get published, right? But you can say that with a nuance. So for example, on page, now I'm looking at his his article, the one you had on your slide, and I'm looking at the end of page 15 and beginning of page 16, where he talks about how he argues that famines in the 19th century had more to do with limited means. So that means poor information, meager infrastructure, and small fiscal capacity, that the British imperial state had it at its disposal, when dealing with natural disasters of such magnitude, rather than liberal ideologies or capitalism. But is Sen talking about liberal ideologies and capitalism? No, he's talking about strong control imperial states, right? So he brushes over, in that sentence at least, he brushes over the other arguments of his opponents, when, you know, his idea of limited means poor information, meager infrastructure, and small fiscal capacity. Yeah, but that's the colonial state that has those limited information. That's their fault that they don't have more information. You know, it's not some fault of somebody else, right? So
Right.
it's again, I'm saying, I think the nuance is missing, and that's where the problem lies, rather than the fact that he has lots of good information. He has lots of good evidence here, right?
Yeah, and it's not like the colonial state doesn't have volumes of information on India, right? So the fact that this is such a lacuna is kind of, you are also wondering what the priorities then of the colonial state are, if it is merely something that is a lack of information, right? Because the colonizing project is a project of collecting knowledge and producing knowledge on the colony itself to a
Yeah,
large
but they have specific goals with that information. So they're only counting certain types of information in order to extract resources from India, right? So they're
Right.
not collecting information in order to keep Indians alive, for example,
Yeah,
or
hence
you
the
know,
priorities of the
Selective
state.
hence
engagement.
yeah,
Very selective
exactly.
engagement.
It's a select, exactly. So that's, and there he's got a point, but it's just that he misses the political ideology. He just doesn't deal with it, right? Yeah.
Right.
In other words, he's not even giving his argument to the existing counter-argument of that political ideology position. See, the
Right.
political ideology is the counter-position to Tirthankar, right? And he glosses over it. He doesn't
Yeah.
address it.
I mean, the welfare state itself sort of becomes ideological in this debate, right? That is the welfare state a question of ideology at all then? Because for Tirthankar Roy, clearly the state is not, welfare is not the state's priority, at least in the colonial state.
Well, yeah, but we can even go further. I think, I mean, I don't know about Roy's political standing, but he's an economic historian in 2025. That means most likely that he's a neoclassical economist working at the LSE. And so he's not going to be very much pro-welfare state, period, right? So that's not what he's going to be looking for in his research either, right?
Right. Hence the location, right?
Location. Exactly. Yeah.
You being at LSE, you being a neoclassical economist, all of it sort of ties in into how your argument actually eventually does end up coming around, right? Okay.
So in some
Is there
sense,
any?
your experience of history influences it too.
Right.
Yes.
The way you've
Absolutely.
experienced your history and the way you choose to experience history influences it. So that's why we say that, you know, when you study history of economic thought, it's important to understand how general history, history of economic thought influences and is influenced by history.
Right.
I think that's something I sometimes find one-sided with Tirthankar.
Say that again. You find it one-sided?
Yeah, because he talks only in terms of a particular experience of history. There are other experiences too, and and the ideas you put forward is influences history and is also influenced by history, correct? So you cannot make this very, what do you say, very picky
Blankets.
and a picky engagement. You just pick what's convenient for you. It's like trying to tell the convenient truth, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think we are entering like a
which-
debate in ourselves.
Yeah, which I think is another kind of lying too. We have to be a little bit careful of that.
Yeah.
But no, but it's raising an important point. When you build an argument, you have to position yourself, which Shachi just said, right? And that positioning means that you have certain biases and you have certain readings of history, and you have to make clear to the readers
Yes.
what
You have
that
to,
position is.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was trying to say. You have to position yourself, saying this is from where I'm coming, and where that's acceptable or not is another question. But that one needs to be honest about that.
And the interesting thing is that when we write academics, of course, it's always understood that we are coming from a position of our own bias. And I'm not saying bias here in a negative way. I mean, we all have a certain lens of what I remember in our political philosophy classes we used to discuss as prejudice, that as individuals in society, we have a view, we have a lens with which we view the world. However, in academic writing, the interesting thing is that even when we give a position, we are always positioning ourselves, but at the same time, we are trying to most of the times appear to be not openly ideological in how we present our arguments. That. So how does one, even this gets into the other sense of how does one create the fairest kind of assessment? In that sense, and the role of, and how do we pick our evidence also, to support our claims, like I mean, like say the way Tirthankar Roy does. So also is also what I mean, just came to mind listening to
I think
your discussion.
Even in the deindustrialization debate, the fact that Tirthankar Roy steps in as a historian who's also talking to people like Nauroji, right, who are not historians as such. So the method itself really changes the way that the kind of shape the debates end up taking. The fact that he comes from a disciplinary perspective rather than the perspective of what you could call like an activist scholar in some way, right, which is what Nauroji is doing to a large degree. Even that changes how we end up looking at something that could be a very valid argument from one perspective or the other. So I think like the disciplinary location as well changes how we are going to play around when we start engaging with any kind of data or evidence, the methods that are prevalent, and knowing the critiques of those methods also probably.
But it's also just a question that Roy is talking, if you're saying that Roy is talking to Nauroji, which I wouldn't even have claimed because it's impossible. Nauroji is coming from the late 19th century. Roy is in the late 20th century. They can't possibly talk to each other. Yes, Nauroji was an activist as well as an economist, mathematician, etc. But it's also because that's what economics was at the time. They were philosophers, political economists, and so on. So having economists talk over hundreds of years is just not possible. So yeah, that's a whole. I think that's a whole nother. Yeah.
No, I'm with you on that. Like I think it's a very common this thing in the colonial Indian thing also, where someone like Ambedkar or Gandhi, they're all philosophers in their own rights, they're lawyers, but they are not academic scholars in the way we consider academia today. So even though there is a conversation that is largely, that is happening somewhere, the disjuncture between those conversations is so large that often this kind of linearity that we create, it's punctuated by so much happening in the middle that I think that's when nuancing our arguments becomes really crucial.
Yeah, in the sense that I suppose how those of us who will see ourselves as historians of economic thought, in a sense, we are, whether we are conversing or talking or engaging with ideas and figures from 100 years ago, like, so how does one create that kind of approach? How does one assess their work and, bring out that? I mean, these are things that we kind of keep in part of historical methods and all that we have to really, keep in mind as we study the past.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it will depend on the historian, right? I contextualize, that's my method or general approach in history of economics, whereas other peers of mine will do a more traditional style of history of economic thought, which is they take the texts and then they look at the differences between them, right? And they interpret these texts as objects of truth, and they don't contextualize them as much, right? And that's another approach. I think it's just as valid, has a different goal, has a different way to do it. But again, this is about positionality. Like who are you, where are you coming from, how do you want to do this, right? And it needs to be clear.
But your texts are located in a certain time and era, right? And so will that play a role in the way the text emerges, text evolves?
Well, I agree, but some people would disagree.
The economist or the writer has written the text.
Right. Yeah. I think it's also something
and the
like,
audience to which they're addressing the text to.
Yeah.
It's also an issue with the archive, right? How do we engage with the archive? Are we reading it as it comes? Are we reading it as a colonial source? Are we reading it against the grain, as it's called, right? And I think that also changes the way that we start writing histories then.
I think, I mean, just for the deviation, sorry, but being little, sorry for being so voluble. I think Farah Ben would probably be a little bit of help to us here.
Sorry.
Farah Ben, he wrote this
Farah
interesting
Ben.
book called as Against Method.
Right.
I think it's probably good to have that, to read that, which I enjoy reading, because it gives a very, very good counterpositions to this
Right.
particular problem that the academic, the politeness of academia, as it were, the seemingly politeness of being academic.
Yeah.
We have thought of working. Sorry, Sharman, please. Yeah.
No. Go ahead. No. I was just going to. I mean, Kranti has of course given a response in the chat, which everyone else can also see. And I
Yeah.
mean, while this discussion is very interesting, but since as moderator just now, maybe I'll try to for one bit pull it back. Since we still have a few attendees here with us, maybe since we have approximately half an hour or so left with us, would maybe we can ask people who are here that do you have any academic arguments or any academic papers that you're working with currently that you're trying to figure out, maybe how does one go about building an argument or something that you can bring out from your own personal experience of researching and writing, that you may want to discuss over here with the instructors.
Or if you have an argument you're struggling to frame, but you have some idea of what you want to do, I mean, maybe we can workshop with that also, something.
Yeah.
So anything.
I mean, there are relatively few people here. So in fact, actually, what we have with us is a small group that normally within which we tend to work. When we are conducting any academic writing exercises. So yeah, okay, Kranti, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, since you said there's a smaller group, I thought I can pitch in. Okay, so regarding the argument, uh, okay, there are three. I struggle when I'm writing. I have like these two or three kinds of pieces that I always want to write. One is proper academic journal article, right? And I am not dealing with history of economic thought per se, but I largely work with the secondary data and then try to make my argument, right? So that's one kind of more like data driven argumentation. But the other one which I'm interested in, for instance, is like I wrote a short piece when I was reading Robinson Crusoe's novel, and then I realized like what Robinson's example, which is usually given in the neoclassical microeconomics, it never tells anything about who Robinson is, the historicity, I mean, of the character and the entire context, right, of capitalism emerging. So that was not. So I tried writing one piece, but I'm not too sure how it turned out. I did write it for myself, right? So that's one kind. But which one shall I present? I mean, I struggle with the framing. Maybe I can show you some of that text also, if you want to workshop around that.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be
Shall I
helpful.
show the Robinson Crusoe one? I think that would be more interesting.
Yeah, we could work with that.
Others also, if you have something, please feel free to share, or you can type in the chat as well if putting your mic on is a bit much.
I don't think I can attach or
Yeah,
share my
I
screen.
don't think, Kranti, you could share, but
I
maybe
did
what you,
that.
yeah, I mean, you can screen share, but maybe you can put your document or something in the chat box here.
Yes, I couldn't upload the one
Or
second.
maybe you can
You
copy
can,
paste, like if there's a small, I don't know.
yeah, maybe if there's like a
I
paragraph or something.
okay. Or shall I just email it to you, Sharman, right away?
Sure.
Okay, give me a second.
Yeah, in the meantime, I think Gerard also,
Yeah.
I think you had raised your
I-
hand. Why don't you go
yeah.
ahead?
I have not put anything on paper or anything yet. I've not done anything of that. It's just this thought which runs in my mind when I teach my students some bit of classical economics, and I look at the Ricardian thinking, especially this idea of international trade. This is the comparative cost idea, as it were. I noticed that seems to be having within it the possibility of creating an intellectual justification for the colonial project. Justifies how you could actually have very, very unequal terms of trade, and you could actually justify colonial exploitation without necessarily stating it openly. It does have the potential to do that. This is a very intuitive feeling at the moment when I look through this. What do you mean by this comparative advantage, right? And how do you acquire it? I mean, I don't think the HO theorem, really justifies that idea because source endowments run through its own difficulties, and they have not included technology as a resource very strongly, I think. So I find this Ricardian thinking having the potential of actually, creating the colonial exploitation project, in the way it sucked out the colonies of its resources and of its people, including, leading to indentured labor. That is something which runs in my mind. I do not know how to structure it yet and how to bring out arguments like this. So this is just a vague thinking that I have in me. I'd be happy if you can give me a potential way I can structure my idea and where I can work through it and what I can look for, what kind of readings to look for. It's just a thought process running in my mind. Maybe it's even a wrong guess. It's possible, but I'm just looking at it possible it's a very intuitive feeling, I guess. Yeah.
Maria, do you want to step in on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have do you mind expanding a bit? I'm not sure I have a response. I need to
my
think.
understanding is when you talk about relative differences giving you advantages, you could be possibly talking of this relative difference from a very absolute position of disadvantage, and you could be possibly working from your least disadvantage, but the position is still from a position of disadvantage. And while
Right.
your relative advantage could also come from an absolute position of advantage where you could be capitalizing on your highest advantage. Both are ultimately relative advantages, logically.
So I think, can I just repeat what I understood of your argument?
Yeah.
I think you're trying to say that the Ricardian model has potential for justifying like colonization.
Yeah.
Through its
logic of
articulation of
articulation. Okay. See, the lowest relative disadvantage and the highest and the highest advantage are both relative advantages, right?
Right.
But the share of your joint gains would be very, very unequal, highly lopsided eventually, because obviously the country or the entity working from its lowest relative disadvantage would be getting a very small share of the joint gains of trade, if ever it happens, isn't it?
Right. I would think that something like this would have been argued.
That's what ultimately the sweatshops are, isn't it? In terms of political and economic experience, what do you think of the Indonesian sweatshops of Nike? How do you, or the sweatshops which make cut diamonds in Surat in India?
Sure. I think sociologically there would be work that would be sort of arguing
There would
this.
be there. Now, if I'm going to be writing a paper in how this idea evolved and how this thinking spanned out, and therefore how the history of colonization influences thinking, how do I go about it? I have a feeling that I must look at this time in which Ricardo lived in. What was the era of colonization that was happening at that time? Was it a period of colonial expansion or colonial consolidation, or a mix of both?
Right. And I think also how advantages are being defined and what is the framework.
Therefore, the notion, exactly. I think that will be a good thing to do. How advantages are defined in history, in economics, I'm sorry, in the train of economic thought, economic ideas.
Yeah. And so I have two things, definitely the context of Ricardo and what other people are saying. And then you might want to also look at Rosa Luxemburg that comes later, of course, but she talks about how capitalism invariably has imperialism because they need to always expand their markets. Like markets always need to expand their markets. So that could be an interesting kind of rebuttal to David Ricardo using her arguments. And then the second thing is that I've always wondered how David Ricardo dealt with the idea of increasing and diminishing returns. That was still pretty prevalent. Like that was still something that, I mean, it's still something we talk about already today in economics, right? It's still today in economics, but I mean, how does he then argue that agricultural, like specialized in agricultural production that has diminishing returns is going to be beneficial, right? So that I would look for that in David Ricardo. I don't have the answer. I would look for that in David Ricardo to try to understand his argument better in order to critique it. And then I think some of the literature of like model, like the history of modeling in economics, the history of mathematization in economics is really important because we cannot forget that Ricardo's model is just a simple, very, very simple mathematical model, right? And he was not the first one to talk about these advantages of specializing in agriculture versus industry. Adam Smith already did some time before, but what Ricardo does is he adds a mathematical model to it that makes it really simple to understand and backs it up with statistics, right? So I think that part of the argument is also really important, and especially because of what your question there with political, or the idea that when you add numbers to something, to an argument, then people tend to automatically agree. Like, oh yeah, that sounds about right, because numbers they are political.
But I do have a problem with that, and that's what I think might be the problem with Ricardo.
Yeah,
might be
because numbers are we perceive them as apolitical and objective.
But
right?
what you count, but what you choose to count is a very political subjective choice, right?
But that's what I mean. I think that your paper needs that discussion.
That's why I'm going to do. So I can, if that's the argument I should bring forward, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that
I think
answers.
also at the time like this.
That's fine. I mean, I'm helpful. I need to. I mean, I'm really looking at where to start. I'm really wondering where to start with. So this is just this,
so much of this line of thinking.
It's an intuition that's there with me.
Right. I think so much of this line of thinking is also built on this sort of Malthusian, almost eschatological sort of fear that emanates post Malthus's theory, that so much of the labor and the economy relation only gets quantified in those terms constantly, right? So I don't know how that would relate for Ricardo itself, but I think a lot of classical economics at the time does emerge, at least in these sort of theories of international trade. They do have some kind of a logic that operates from that initial logic of what Malthus is saying. I could be wrong, but
I'll keep in mind. It'll be helpful for me. That's very good. I mean, thank you to both of you. Thank you to Maria and Sachi. I think I have some kind of a thing, at least to know where to start my reading. It's good.
That's very helpful. I will say too that I think we mentioned context already, but one specific thing about David Ricardo, at least that was my interpretation, was that we have to understand where David Ricardo was writing from, and he was writing from an industrialized country looking at other agricultural economies. And so he just accepted the world the way it was. Whereas, the Indian economists that I look at, they saw the world, but they couldn't accept it because they were so poor and said, this is not right? We don't want this, right? And also because their interpretation of history, which I think is partially correct, is that, well, they were progressive in the past or richer in the past, and now they weren't anymore, right? So they, from their history and their positioning, they could see another world that David Ricardo couldn't and didn't want to see either.
Yeah, I think Thomas Metcalfe does like some good analysis of in ideologies of the Raj, from where you could find like possible entry points into looking at this. I think Ricardo's also a British parliamentarian, if I'm not mistaken. So
yes, he did.
Really
he was a parliamentarian.
The way that this conversation
House of Commons, and was responsible for many things.
Yeah, okay, we can look at
Close by
Kranti's.
Yeah, I've just so I put it up here, Kranti's piece for EPW Engage.
Yeah, I
And
sent
I
it
think
one
I
year
think it's
back, but no response though.
no response. Okay, good.
I
It's
mean,
a
they
true
sent an
working.
acknowledgement or whatever, but after that they didn't respond. But I really,
EPW also takes ages, I think.
the reason I've sent it is actually this. I wrote it for my own teach as a to use it as a teaching material, but I felt it took some shape, and so I thought let me send it somewhere because I don't know what kind of places even take these articles. So yeah, but
So actually, so what we have before us is a very useful thing because the abstract is actually a great way to tell what is the intention of the author for the essay. And then, and maybe, and how is it that you have kind of have gone about looking at it, So, I mean, maybe if here everyone can kind of just go through what are the claims that the author is making here through the
It's
abstract
also such a
itself.
throwback to like my Principles of Economics 101 class when I was in college because I remember the Robinson Crusoe economy example like always coming in. So yeah,
But
it's also
I would
good in terms of pedagogy, I think, for you to enter this. Sorry, Maria, please.
no, I would love to hear you tell us what are you doing with this article in your own words or
okay.
verbally.
So usually when I teach microeconomics, students never connect to the examples that we give or the assumptions that we make, right? And often I also sometimes I used to take this example of Robinson Crusoe as a representative uh, individual and go ahead with my analysis. But I came across this book and then I was shocked to know that this book is, I mean, Robinson Crusoe is someone who belongs to 1600s and 1700s when capitalism was actually emerging. You see all in Britain what is happening and how. So all his movement, right? I mean, who he was as a person before ending up or getting stranded on this island was a product of capitalist development, right? I mean, he is from Britain, the Great Britain, and then he lands on a ship and then he goes somewhere, he gets captured as a slave. Sometime later, he becomes a plantation owner in Brazil, but through networks and relationships. And so, even in this entire process, when the relationship between a white man and a black man, right? Also, how race enters and how you're entering in a relationship with another person is a product of historical consciousness, and it's not like any individual stands the same chance. So, knowing this history and who Robinson Crusoe made me feel like, okay, I need to write this down, put this down to show that there's a context to it, right? So you cannot talk about anything representative. I mean, there is no representative individual or a representative firm without time and space, without history. So that's what I wanted to show in this article. But through instances or incidents in the novel, just picking them up and making it. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I would read that paper. So I guess two things. I'm wondering whether this question, like political, I guess I'm slightly in the field of political economy, but I'm not sure. I wonder if this term isn't too large. Like, is it like could the question be more specific in like if we contextualize Robin Crusoe, would we understand him better? Or I mean, you can find better phrases. That's my first point. And that then, and I say this in terms of building an argument, is and don't I mean, promise too much or be too vague about the kind of beginnings of your argument. And then the second thing is, so of course I don't see the list of your references here, but I'm imagine that there's lots been written on Robin Crusoe, right? So how do you think, are you sure that what you're doing is radically different than from what's already been done? I mean, I'm assuming you did. I'm not saying you didn't. I would find that quite a task in this, like picking such a famous example is difficult. And then the third thing, which is more of a strategy thing, I see that you've submitted it to EPW.
Yeah.
There's
Engage.
lots of there's also lots of great history of economic thought, history of economics journals that would be really interested in your question. So, for example, history of political economy, based at Duke University. They're very much into this kind of more contextual approach in history of economics that I think might be a good second place to send it to if ever EPW doesn't come back positive.
Yeah, I don't think it's coming back. So yeah.
It take a very
Yeah,
long
a
time.
year is a year is quite a while. I mean, I wonder if they, I remember speaking to someone who works at EPW. They were saying on every week they get 120 to 140 submissions. So it's I mean, and even though it's a weekly. So at that, they say at the outset, they said before we don't even have time to read full papers to reject them. So within
No.
the first, while just reading the abstract itself is where I think many papers get rejected. Then after that, well, you can
In fact,
imagine.
that's why I've sent it to EPW Engage, which is a
Engage,
digital
yeah, because
one, which is a which
ex-
doesn't have a specified format per se.
yeah, that's not the properly academic.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's academic, but it's in between. It's in
Yeah.
between the magazine and the academic journal, right?
Yeah,
EPW.
I thought my article is also somewhere in between, and that's why.
Yeah. Yeah, I can. So, but
But I
it's,
would
I think, but even then, it's a very useful piece to look at, to just see maybe even if you're just studying the one text, even if you're
Yeah.
building your entire argument only from Robinson Crusoe, even if it's not a full-fledged academic paper in that sense, as to maybe how is it that you're pulling out evidence from different places and even from the novel itself,
Right,
maybe you
yeah.
could tell us a little bit about that process as well.
No, so you see, okay, the property rights, whatever he talks about property rights, so that's something so let's say how he feels about property when he's alone in this island, and how he um, enters into property right relation with others. Like for instance, first he meets this Friday who's a black man, but to Friday also automatically accepts him as a master, and he's only toiling as a worker, and never the question of equality arises. But later at some point a white man shows up, and Robinson Crusoe immediately looks up to him as a owner, right? He says we can share, we can cultivate together, we can have the profits shared or whatever earned as a manager. So I mean, where is this coming from, right? So property, so if you are not talking about, there are three people now on this island, but two are owners and one is not, one is worker. Like how did this relationship come about, right? For instance, so I was basically picking up on such instances, right? Yeah.
I think,
Is that
Kranti,
what
there
you're
is
asking?
something definitely to be said about the fact that this is also one of those examples that we have all read at a level when we were like 18, 19, 20, right? If you're studying economics.
Yeah.
And so pedagogically, the prevalence of this example also says something about like the discipline and method in economics per se. The fact that we continue this engagement as like the classic example of a one-person economy, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so I think, I don't know if that would be in the context of this particular paper, but I think there is definitely something to be said in that sense.
Yeah, and
No,
that's a
actually,
good approach. That would be quite an interesting contribution. You're talking about, look, this example in our economics classes says something about the methodology we use in economics, and then you could write to an audience like the Journal of History of Economics Methodology, right? And they'd be very interested in something like that.
That's interesting. Yeah.
In fact, if I could just and also I'm immediately, now this is where my attention goes here, and I've highlighted that little portion. He has dual object, which is in your introductory paragraph. It's saying he has dual objectives, that is to maximize his utility as a consumer and to maximize his profits as a producer. Now, of course, I understand this is not being it's being written for a different type of text. So you're not here to sit and qualify maybe every single statement you're making, but for now, if you're going to kind of treat it as an academic text, so what
Right.
can we do then? So like my first thing goes is that how did you assume that you can use the framework, you can use the concept of utility, where is it coming from, in the sense that in this, what I'm trying to say here is that Robinson Crusoe is written as a novel in that sense, and you have brought in certain economic concepts and categories and applied it also based on how commonsensically Robinson Crusoe is introduced in pedagogy. By the way, just to place it out there, I have not come across, I mean, based on my own academic training, Robinson Crusoe is not an example that I've encountered, because in fact, I'm not having studied economics. So, but I hear this from
Lipsy and
economics
Crystal
students.
had it. There was this book called Lipsy and Crystal. Even that was like the first.
Very first chapter.
That has it,
Yeah. So, but this I've heard through other people's talking about Robinson Crusoe coming in economics courses. So I have only encountered Robinson Crusoe more so by when as a kid I had read like an abridged version of the novel, So that has been that was my introduction to. So I have never even thought of him in this kind of sense, as so to say that if I were to put it that Smithian term, the Homo economicus, in that kind of frame, the true rational individual working over here. So for example, I mean, and this is of course also for the purposes of the workshop, to say that how is it that we have thought of, classifying him as a consumer, who has this, for whom there is something known as, maximizing utility, and also the connection of him as a producer, and a producer trying to also have profits in that sense, So it's interesting to see how in an academic framework we would maybe, bring in how we would address this issue differently, maybe, So that is immediately, of course, a question that comes to my mind. And I don't know if others have any thing to say about this.
I guess I can probably share this with Maria, Sachi, and you can look at it whenever you have time and give me any comments. That would be great, because this been sitting in my desk. Now that we're talking, I suddenly remembered this and I thought I'd share. But hearing you, I'm also getting a few ideas on how I can probably rewrite or
It
implement.
also reminds me of this anthropological reading called Emily Martin's The Egg and the Sperm, where she does a reading of undergraduate medical textbooks to see how the egg and the sperm are turned into these stereotypes of gender. And I think a similar reading of these foundational texts in, core economic theory could be looked at also. So it just reminds me of that possibility.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to read it.
Yeah, I'll send it. Thank you.
Anything in
the Emily
novel
Martin text
which
is
indicates that?
Sorry?
Anything in the text of the novel, you could also use a textual analysis. Is the text of the novel speak of this idea of utility and profits? It may not be using the same words. Those are our words, and those are the words of modern economic lingo. But they would be actually implying that in many different ways. Because you're talking of a literary piece.
Correct.
So the literary piece could be talking, maybe you should pick up the parts of the text which actually bring that idea out.
Right. Okay.
That's one thing which I do when I work on, when I try to work on these things. I like to bring out the parts of the text that actually tends to give this. It doesn't come directly. Nobody says it directly. I mean, in fact, we could even ask the question, why is Man Friday called Friday? The name of the week.
Because he was found on Friday, I think that was.
Friday on Friday. Who decides what's Friday? She was talking about the Augustinian calendar, right? There's a certain frame of time, an understanding of time.
Yeah.
So Robinson Crusoe is imposing his understanding of time on another culture, which has could have a different understanding of time. Isn't it?
It's that other thing. So in fact, what immediately now comes to mind is the connection, and maybe I wish we had even had a chance to speak about this more earlier. the connection that every academic argument is actually, in a sense, a combination of the theory and the empirical. In that sense, that it's actually a combination of both. It can't be all theory, it cannot be all empirical, which is where then you create the balance between and moving from the descriptive to the analytical. So as Gerard was pointing out, that we look for parts of the novel, that are our empirical material, on which
That's an evidence.
we have imposed, on which not imposed, but on which we have interpreted, and we have found what we can see from existing theoretical frameworks that are relevant to it. And maybe you can find other theories or other theoretical frameworks coming from different ideologies as well, that can be applied to maybe understanding this. Like in fact, it's interesting you brought up the example of time, because one of the things I've encountered is also, as you're saying, the imposition of the clock, clockwork time and industrial time, essentially, as it's not set, in a sense, in the agrarian mode of time, where time is seen in a more circular, seasonal sense, but the division of the day into specific hours and minutes and all of that. So
linear.
The linear time, and that's
what Benedict Anderson calls homogeneous empty time.
Empty time.
Right,
Yeah. In his study on nationalism, on imagined communities. So yeah. Right. Also, I don't know, Kranti, any?
Yeah.
I mean, since we have been discussing,
Maybe we can ask like a few others also who are still on the call, if they have something to add, because Avantika, Dennis, Jyoti, Shuchita, Umesh, Priyanka.
Yeah, I mean, we have a few more minutes. We have a few more minutes remaining, but in case anybody feels like, or even just giving us any type of feedback as well, since we're a small group here, it would just help us also to know, how has this workshop been useful in any ways, or maybe what would you have liked to hear more about, these kind of things, because that would help us if we want to even maybe rework project workshops like this in the future, or something like that. It would be great to hear from any of you.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
So I'm just at the beginning of my education in a way, because I've just completed masters in economics, and now I'm just going to enter into PhD. I'll just be applying in a couple of places in this cycle. So the kind of discussion I was actually, because in some certain places we are supposed to submit a research proposal, and I have been having a lot of problems with formulating the arguments. That's one reason why I wanted to attend the workshop, because I have a lot of things I have been reading, as I think one of the professors pointed out right at the beginning, that sometimes we read a lot and we end up thinking that everybody has almost covered all the fields and there's nothing left for us to add in. So that's one problem that I've been facing a lot, because while writing, I'm thinking, what am I adding in? So that was actually kind of a relief to hear at the beginning. And then the entire way in which the way an academic argument is supposed to be formulated. So that is actually going to help me a lot in the writing part of it. I'm really grateful for it.
And Shuchita, just to point out, if you're applying for a PhD, please don't pressure yourself with having an argument before you apply, right? Your PhD is supposed to be about you building the argument. So I think have a solid question and a sense of an argument is enough at the point. So don't overwhelm yourself, please. Maria.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's the research question that's really important, and then showing the panel members, the juries, that you have some sense of understanding of what the literature has done so far and how you're doing things slightly differently, right? But I just wanted to say that the list of resources that I put on the last two slides and the second to last one, for example, there's a blog post called How to Write a Paragraph, which you'd say, well, how does that have anything to do with what we've done today? Well, in fact, every paragraph is like a building block to your argument, right? And that blog post is based on a chapter in the book that I link at the beginning called Authoring a PhD, which is a book that every PhD student in the UK has to read at the beginning of their PhD. Nobody does, by the way, but they should. But the author of that book then wrote short blog posts describing all the component parts of his book that are much more, I found, much more easily digestible. And the one on how to write a paragraph, I think, could help you understanding how you build like your argument. And I guess your argument here would be, so you arguing why you're doing something different, or you arguing why this question is relevant, right? Because those are the two key points of a research proposal, right? Why is your question important, and how do you situate yourself in the literature, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, those are some useful tips, that I wish there were people who really also guided us through writing research proposals. Something I, and struggled with so much, and in a sense just learned by, accident, really. Through accidents, one kind of kept landing up on what does it mean to create a research proposal, right?
I'm not sure if I have learned as yet also.
Yeah,
I
that's
should
true.
know
That's true.
how
I
I'm doing
still,
Very true.
I don't know. Does anybody else? We have basically now just 2 minutes remaining to official close of time. But any more comments before we
Sachi, I just have
officially
one
close?
thing which I missed out from you. You had spoken something about the writings of the agenda of the Raj. Could you name the person you had mentioned, Sachi?
It's Thomas Metcalfe. It's called Ideologies of the Raj.
Metcalfe, is it? Ideologies of the Raj, is it?
Yeah.
Thank you. And could you
Okay,
share your slides, Sachi? Share them.
Sure. Let me just, how are you sending our slides, Maria? Did you send it on the chat or?
Yeah, I just sent it on the chat, but I also shared it with Shaman. If you can also email the participants.
Email it,
So
yeah, it'll be very
Sharmin, I'll
better.
send you my updated
Yeah,
PPT
okay.
and maybe you can share it with the participants. Yeah?
Sure. I'll do that. Yeah, I can share both Maria and Shachi's slides then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So,
Thank you
I
so
mean,
much.
we can continue this conversation. We can continue this conversation post 7:30. But I think because some people may need to leave, I just want to at least formally close the event. So thank you everyone, all those who have joined in and who have stayed on right until the end. I hope you had a fruitful, time being part of this workshop and learned something as well along the way. I, of course, want to thank both our instructors here, Maria and Shachi. That was I think, a very helpful and engaging session. We tried to work with different kinds of materials and all. So thanks a lot for giving your time to this. And maybe I think we are also learning the process of how we should conduct such workshops. And we hope this should be the first of more to come, and more. And maybe we'll also think of different ways of conducting this. But yeah, so with that, I'd like to just thank everyone, and at least I think now we can formally close the recording of the event. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shaman,
Thank
for
you.
organizing.
Yeah, thanks, Sharmin. Thanks,
well.
Maria.
Bye.
It was lovely to work with you. Hope we'll stay in touch, I guess.
Yeah. Lots more stuff we could do.
Yeah. I think it's been a good feedback also to see how the interaction went.
Yeah.
We know what we need to do differently. Or not.